for you, Dr. Britton. There are many things to cover on that bill, but before we get into that, I would like to have your perspective on, because you did mention it a little bit, and many have mentioned the short-term effect of nicotine in vaping, but I want you to elaborate a little bit on the expected or predicted long-term effect on the e-cigarette. And of course, Mr. Hammond, you'll be free to follow.
Thank you. Nicotine itself has effects of increasing heart rate, increasing blood pressure, constricting blood vessels, and these are effects, as I said in my testimony, which on the grand scheme of things are on a par with the kinds of things we get from caffeine. So it's not a particularly hazardous drug in its own right. We're better off not using it, but it's not a drug that on its own will kill you. The other components of vapor, we don't know what the long-term effects. In fact, for start, we don't know what the long-term effects of inhaling pure nicotine would be. We don't know what the long-term effects of exposure of the lung to propylene glycol, those vapor solutions that have glycerine in them, glycerine also. And then the toxins that are produced in the vaping process from the constituents of the fluid, which produce some acrolein, for example, potentially carcinogenic toxins, produce some particulates, and with flavored solutions, oxidants in the vapor too. Now, those things I would expect to cause lung damage in the long term, and this is covered in last year's RCP report. We would expect the spectrum of damage to include a similar spectrum of lung disease to existing smoking, but at a much, much lower level of risk. So there will, in my opinion, over the next 50 years, be a handful of cases of lung cancer caused by vaping. But that has to be set aside the likelihood of tens of thousands of cases of lung cancer caused by smoking. So while we have that perspective, electronic cigarettes are not safe, or it's very unlikely that they will be safe. We won't know how safe they are until 2 or 3 decades have gone by. But we can predict from the levels of toxin in the vapor that risk will be very low relative to cigarette smoking. And in the RCP report, we said that it is very unlikely to exceed 5% of the risk of smoking. Could I just comment in this response on flavors? I know David Hammond very well, and I respect his opinions on most areas of tobacco control. The experience of flavors in the United Kingdom is that many smokers find pure nicotine solutions aversive to use. I find that surprising because they can inhale tobacco smoke, but they find nicotine solutions aversive. And many smokers use flavors which we might consider to be children's flavors to make vaping acceptable to them. And that's why I think in many ways you have it right in that you are saying that you can't advertise a flavor as a child-friendly flavor. But I think taking flavors away from vaping will dramatically reduce the number of smokers who make the switch, and that would be bad for public health.
Thank you, Dr. Britton. Dr. Hammond.
I would echo everything that Dr. Britton has said about the long-term health effects. This debate has been one of the more difficult ones for the public health community. And on the face of it, it would appear like there's a lot of contradictory evidence. But really, I think there's been 2 arguments. One half of folks are saying that e-cigarettes are likely to be harmful, and the other half is saying that they're less harmful than smoking. Both of those things are likely to be true. I've read, tens of thousands of industry documents, and you can go back to the 1950s when Philip Morris researchers said, even back then, I don't think we can clean smoke very much. We'll try, but if we have to, we're probably going to have to deliver nicotine through something else like vapor. We have a tendency to treat e-cigarettes as if they're an alien product. We already have medicinal products that deliver nicotine through different means. If you chew gum, you absorb nicotine in your mouth or upper throat. If you have a patch, you absorb it through your skin. So the mode of delivery is very important in terms of determining the level of risk, and nothing is as dirty as smoke. And so the bind that we're in, as Dr. Britton has said, is that it will be several decades before we can precisely estimate what the risk is, and that's because there's a lag period for a lot of these diseases. But there is ample evidence to state right now that vaporized products will be less harmful than smoked tobacco products, and they are also very likely to produce harm. And that's why I always use the frame harmful but less harmful than smoking. And I think it's taken a few years, but you're starting to see that consensus reflected in public health authorities.
Thank you. Senator Seidman to be followed by Senator Eggleton.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for your presentations, and I would like to follow along in this line of questioning, if I may, because both of you have made reference to harm reduction and comparison of risks. And Dr. Britton, you particularly have talked about Sweden as an example of evidence where, in fact, a tobacco product was used non-combustible. This piece of legislation, Dr. Britton, you have specifically said precludes this kind of comparison of risks. Although e-cigarette products can go through the normal FDA channels, but non-combustible tobacco products cannot. So what I'd like to perhaps ask both of you, starting with Dr. Britton, because you very clearly refer to this issue, is that clause that you refer to in this legislation, how can we fix it? If it's so important to be able to talk about harm reduction and comparison of risks, what should we do with this piece of legislation to fix that?
Dr. Britton.
Well, I think it's important that health professionals, public health opinion leaders, governments can talk about these products in the way that Dr. Hammond has said, of just acknowledging the truth, which is they are not safe, but they are substantially less harmful than smoking. But without that strong message, smokers reach the conclusion that they're much the same. And therefore, if the government isn't endorsing them, or if my doctor isn't endorsing them, I might as well carry on smoking. So I would just take out the prohibition of making any comparison. I think if this depends on how the FDA laws work for you. In the United Kingdom, electronic cigarette promoters are not allowed to say that this product will help you stop smoking because that's a medicinal claim. And to make that, they would have to go through the British equivalent of approval through the MHRA, Medicines Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority. And it would be nice if some of them did that. However, our MHRA has taken what it views as a liberal line on nicotine regulation for products such as electronic cigarettes since 2010, and not one product has achieved a medical license and appearing on the market. So whilst I think we would all prefer that these products met medicine standards to guarantee minimum risk to users, the reality is that medicines regulation is too complex, too slow, and people are dying as a consequence of the lack of products while we wait for medicinal approval. So anyway, so the compromise that we have in the UK is that you can't make a claim that makes it sound like a medicine, but you can say this product is likely to be substantially less harmful than smoking. So make the switch.
Thank you. Dr. Hammond.
Look, I think that's a very good question. I've been asking myself that over the last few days. I mean, I'll start by saying that, therapeutic claims in terms of cessation, I mean, we have a framework for that through the Food and Drug Act. I think that's important, particularly given that it allows potentially for greater advertising, and companies should be incentivized to go through that product if they believe that they have a therapeutic one. So I think that remains important. What I would suggest or prefer is a tightly regulated claim. I'm very conscious of letting the industry dictate the communication on health and relative risks, and I think that there are some concerns there. My preference would be to allow something like a tightly regulated claim, something as simple as harmful but less harmful than smoking. So I believe that the message is a fundamentally important one. It's not an endorsement of use, it's an acknowledgement of fact. And as I said, it's taken us a little ways to get here, but I think it's time that we need to acknowledge the facts in terms of the potential risks. But I wouldn't give the sort of industry a sort of a blank check to go and sort of frame that health communication. I would prefer to have it tightly regulated.
Thank you. Senator Eggleton to be followed by Senator Stuart Olson.
Well, thank you very much for both of you being here. You're excellent witnesses, and I think are helping us a great deal. I buy the argument that the vaporized product is less harmful, even though we don't know the long-term effects, and it will take some time. I think both of you have said that. But I'll come back to the flavors, because I think here what we're trying to do is prevent kids from getting into this kind of product as much as tobacco. We don't want them into that either. But we don't want them in this, and the feeling is that having flavors that relate to things that they're attracted to, bubblegum flavors or whatever else, is something that may entice them and act as a gateway. So we want to prevent that on the one hand, but on the other hand, we're recognizing that this can be valuable as to help cessation of smoking. Now, the people I've talked with who are in that latter category think that the flavor of the product is an important aspect. So where do we draw the line here? Where do we reconcile this? Trying to keep it out of the hands of kids, but trying to make it still something that people that want to quit smoking will find appealing. And I'm told that the taste is a factor in all that. So I'll start with Dr. Hammond on that, and then Dr. Britton.
Well, I'll start by agreeing with what you said anecdotally and what Dr. Britton said, which is the flavor is very important. But you can allow flavor without allowing all flavors. And, we know, so we've done research asking, tens of thousands of youth, have you tried and what flavor? We've done experimental studies to test the appeal of different flavors. There are some flavors that preferentially target kids. Candy, many types of candy. There are other flavors that may appeal to both, but aren't preferentially targeting kids. For example, fruit flavors. So I wouldn't suggest a ban on flavors. I would simply suggest a ban on flavors that preferentially target kids. And I think there's a wide scope for having flavors, mint and fruit flavors and things like that we know many smokers use. In fact, those are some of the most flavors out there to begin with. So I wouldn't suggest banning those, but I don't think you need flavors that preferentially target kids, or my favorite flavor I've seen is unicorn horn flavor. I think we need some bounds in terms of keeping these to a reasonable scope.
Dr. Britton.
I agree. I'm perhaps a little bit more liberal on flavours. The data from the ASH survey that I mentioned earlier in my testimony found that in the UK, the 42% of electronic cigarette users use fruit-flavoured products. 23% choose tobacco, 13% menthol. So fruit flavours with adults are very important. And we run a panel, a smokers group in Nottingham to try research ideas out on them and to get their feedback on what we're doing. And we had a session once on flavours and how important they were. There are a number of vapers in that group. And they said, take the flavours away and it will be very difficult for me to continue vaping. So I think the key is to allow the flavours to be there. And I may have misunderstood the bill, but I thought that what you were trying to achieve was to stop those flavours being promoted in a way that would appeal to children. But I don't see why you can't have an electronic cigarette vapor on a shelf in a plain bottle that says cherry flavour. And that would allow the smoker to use it. Where flavours are a problem are that most of the flavours used in electronic cigarette fluid are food flavours, which were never designed to be heated. And when you do heat them, you get much of the toxin that appears in different electronic cigarette vapors comes from the flavours. So my advice to the smokers that I treat is very much, if you can, use an unflavoured solution. If you have to use a flavour, use menthol, because that's something that's probably better in those circumstances, but it's better to avoid the fruit flavours. But the fact remains that many smokers want them. So I think it would be a mistake to withdraw that option.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Stewart-Olson to be followed by Senator Petitclerc. Yep.
Thank you, gentlemen, both of you, for being with us. Dr. Britton, in the UK, have the government actually said this is a benefit to helping you stop smoking? Has the government actually come out and made that statement?
I'm trying to think of an explicit statement, use electronic cigarettes. Our government has come out several times in saying that harm reduction is an important complement to established tobacco control in different ways. In its last two tobacco control policies, in our cancer reform strategy, our Public Health England, which now leads on public health in the English National Health Service, has come out very strongly in saying that electronic cigarettes are a good thing for English public health. That's their jurisdiction is England. And have published a document a year or so ago listing the medical organisations that support that position, and it is the great majority. So we are in a situation where we, as Dr. Hammond has said, we have a growing consensus that these products are helpful. They are being adopted into our NHS-run stop smoking services. The teaching and leadership organisation for those is something called the National Centre for Smoking Cessation Training. They put out a briefing about a year ago explaining how to integrate electronic cigarette use when treating smokers and offering them evidence-based cessation care. So we're pretty much there. There are some dissenting voices in the UK as elsewhere in the world, but we're pretty much there.
Anything to add?
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, and I still am skeptical about politicians actually saying this is helpful. So thank you.
Dr. Hammond.
It is what will be very helpful. I mean, I'm a researcher. We always think there should be more research, but we do need more evidence to understand, for example, are e-cigarettes equally effective as other forms of nicotine replacement therapy? Are they more? Are they slightly less? We know that they're certainly more appealing to use. But I would go back to what Dr. Britton said, which is I think it's important to separate the 2 points. One is with respect to their relative harm, and the other one is with respect to the efficacy as a cessation device. And I think we have, I suspect that both of those will come to be, but I think we have a lot more reason to believe certainly in the difference of relative harm at this point. I'd like to make one very small point about dual use. I mean, I always say I personally believe that vaporized products will have a public health benefit. But again, it depends how they're used. And one of the dominant form of use in Canada is dual use, where you smoke and use a vaporized product. And the best science we have to date suggests that there may not be any health benefit from doing that you have to get off the smoke. Now, some people may be using it to cut back and plan to quit over the long term, and that will be a positive outcome. But we need to make sure that these products are framed as a way to get people off smoking and not just as a complement to smoking. And that's where I would return to some of the messages around advertising. So I'm sorry if that was a bit broader than your question, but it relates to the idea of positioning these as cessation products.
Dr. Britton, you wanted to come back in on this.
Yeah, it was on the dual use issue, and a point which I think hasn't yet been made. So Dr. Hammond is talking about our lack of understanding of where these products sit relative to established licensed nicotine replacement therapies. There are 2 or 3 points relevant to this. The first is that in the UK, the MHRA, in its attempt to liberalise nicotine regulation or make it simpler, declared that any product that delivers nicotine is an effective smoking cessation aid. And the efficacy there depends on how quickly and how much nicotine it can deliver. So if an electronic cigarette delivers nicotine, it works as a cessation aid. But what's very important, and where the strength of electronic cigarettes and other products that may come along like them lies, is in that they are a social consumer alternative to smoking, not a therapy, first and foremost. So the therapeutic decision is made by the smoker who walks into a newsagent or a tobacconist or whatever the term would be in Canada and thinks, well, instead of buying a packet of cigarettes today, I will buy an electronic cigarette. There's no commitment to quit. It's just experimentation. And it is inevitable that there will be substantial dual use of those products. But the UK approach, which is embodied in guidance by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, is that encouraging smokers to take up an alternative source of nicotine and use it as a dual user will generate quit attempts. And that's simply because a smoker who thinks I cannot get through the day without a cigarette, who tries an alternative product and finds that actually they can get through, say, till lunchtime without a cigarette, will think, well, if I can do 4 hours, I can do 8, and if I can do 8, I can do a day, and so on. And the evidence is good that smokers who start using an alternative nicotine product alongside smoking are much more likely, twice as likely, to progress to quit than those who do not. I entirely agree with Dr. Hammond that while they're dual using, the benefit to health is negligible. But those that then make the step completely to an alternative source will get huge benefit. But the key thing is that consumer product positioning, not a medicinal product. We shouldn't think of these as cessation aids. We should think of them as tobacco substitutes.
Thank you. Senator Petitclerc, to be followed by Senator Seidman.
Merci beaucoup. My question.
Thank you.
Dr. Britton, as you know, this bill is really trying to achieve this balance in protecting our youth and giving access to smokers who want to stop. So I want to hear you about, in your experience, in the UK experience, if you saw a bit of a side effect in terms of the market, you know, once you have the vaping products and the advertising and maybe the promotion or information of it, do you feel that the UK was able to contain vaping products to smokers wanting to quit, or did it attract a whole new market of non-smokers starting to vape? Is what I'm trying, because I know we're talking about the gateway situation with the kids, but maybe on a broader term for kids for sure, but also for non-smokers, adult, and if you want to do that.
Dr. Britton.
Thank you.
Thank you. The short answer is that in the UK, electronic cigarettes are being used almost exclusively by smokers. So the concern that you express is one that we all share, that children become addicted to these products and move on to become smokers. And for the 4 years or so that we have decent data in the UK, that just hasn't happened. Use of nicotine by non-smoking children is negligible. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because unlike most other drugs that have a street trade or an illegal trade, nicotine doesn't make you feel good. So early experiences with nicotine, as anybody sitting around your table now will recall, are actually quite aversive. So there is a lot of child experimentation with electronic cigarettes in the UK because adolescent kids try things. But for the great majority of those, it's a trial and then thinking, what's the point, and move on to the next thing. So use by never smokers is negligible. So thus far, at least, we have no grounds to be concerned that there will be a big gateway effect.
Dr. Hammond?
Yeah, and I can certainly speak to the Canadian market. You know, we have had a very large number of Canadian youth, including non-smokers, try e-cigarettes. But it is also true that very, very few of those go on to use them regularly. So most of them just try it, and it looks like they try it once or twice, and that's it. So I would say, like the UK, we have I think it's fair to say, negligible levels of regular use among non-smoking youth, and that's very important. I think for all the reasons Dr. Britton said, but I would state that that's not a fixed quotient. So one of the things that a lot of people talk about is the evolution of these devices and their ability to deliver nicotine. And for a smoker, you want it to compete with cigarettes in terms of nicotine delivery. And there's a lot of talk about promise of better nicotine delivery over the coming years. And so that conversion factor, which is very low right now from trial to regular use, that may not be a fixed quotient. Now, I don't say that in an alarmist way. I've stated that I believe that we should make these products more available to smokers, but I would just note that it's not a given. And that along with the product itself and the drug itself, that's where marketing and promotion are very important in terms of shaping who uses the product. So, the bill is trying to achieve that balance, and I think it's important that it seeks to do so.
Thank you. Senator Seidman, followed by Senator Eggleton.
Thank you. And both of you are providing us with enormously important testimony, and I thank you both very much for that. I did want to ask you about the gateway effect and whether cigarettes, e-cigarettes specifically, would tend to renormalize smoking after, long public health anti-smoking campaigns over decades. And you've partially addressed that issue, but there isn't a whole lot of scientific evidence to date on this matter. And I'm wondering if you can help me understand, if I look at, for example, 1 in 4 Canadian youth aged 15 to 19 reported ever having tried an e-cigarette, and 1 in 3 young adults 20 to 24. This is the, up-to-date 2015 numbers. So 18% of students in grades 6 to 12 have ever used an e-cigarette. Okay, so it's pretty low, but what do you think, and what kind of science do we need to determine that, in fact, that we're not en route to renormalization of smoking for a whole new generation?
Dr. Hammond.
Dr. Hammond, perhaps you could start.
We don't know, and we can't know ahead of time. What we do know is the ways in which advertising and marketing shapes social norms and how it's done that for tobacco. And we've got the first half of the last century in terms of promoting its uptake, and then we have the second half of the century trying to unravel that. And we see it in the conclusion with something like plain and standardized packaging. So we know it can be done, and I think I consider myself to be quite a centrist on this type of issue. But when you think about allowing advertisements on TV and radio, and when you consider, even if you try and prevent cross-branding, it is extremely difficult, as I said, to determine what is adult-oriented and what is youth-oriented. And by the time we figure it out and we act, it's 5 or 10 years later. And so I come back to, will advertising and marketing promote use that benefits public health, or will it promote the other side of use, which, although it's negligible now, may or may not undermine it? And even if it doesn't make kids want to try vaporized nicotine products, it could renormalize smoking. So I am not an alarmist on this issue, but it is alarming to think about the extent of marketing for nicotine products, particularly for companies that also have a main primary interest in selling tobacco products. And what is proposed in the bill is beyond what I understand will be allowed in New Zealand, for example, or what is currently allowed in UK, where they don't allow TV and radio advertising based on a European directive. So I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer to your question, but I think even though we haven't seen it to date, it remains a possibility, and advertising and marketing, above all, I think will be the determinant of that.
Because you're making an important point. And so are you suggesting that this bill ought to be more restrictive as far as advertising is concerned to youth?
I am. I think you can think about, I think about advertising 2 ways. One, in terms of its content, so that would be whether it's appealing to youth or not, and the second one is where it's allowed in channels. And I think again, I do not believe that allowing lifestyle advertising will make a smoker any more likely to switch. They have every incentive to do so, and I think there are other very important ways of incentivizing that through price, differential health warnings, and things like that. So I personally don't see the value of lifestyle advertising. Secondly, I'm concerned about advertising in channels, even if it's meant to be non-lifestyle advertising that will be viewed by our children, and that would be TV, radio, and some of those other mainstream channels.
And did you say there was a particular country that we ought to have a look at as a model?
I was just pointing out that my understanding is that New Zealand has proposed new regulations as of last week, and my understanding is that they have not allowed adult-oriented advertising in TV and radio. My understanding is that that's no longer allowed in the UK. So those could be possible models, but I don't pretend to know those regulations terribly well.
Okay, thank you. Dr.
I'm going to follow up here. Dr. Hammond, related to this, you made a comment earlier with regard to the possible conversion of youth vapor smokers, into tobacco. One of the issues around this. Could you elaborate as to whether there is any evidence that you're aware of that a youth taking up vaping, what percentage go on to be smokers?
We will actually have a study come out in a medical journal very soon that shows that we follow people up over time. And so we followed kids up, about 20,000 kids over 12 months. And everyone was a non-smoker at the start. And the kids among those who are non-smokers who tried a vaping product were much more likely to go on to become a smoker. But here's the thing with that. We call it the gateway effect. It's true for tobacco and alcohol and marijuana, and most of that is that the kids who are likely to smoke are also likely to try a vaping product. So this is, again, in the fog of all these findings. So is there association? Yes. Is it causal? It's probably just the common factor of the kids who like to do those things. It's like predicting one nicotine product with another. So, and I would reiterate that it is very low. It is very uncommon for a non-smoker youth to use e-cigarettes regularly. So we have not seen it, and I would absolutely echo what Dr. Britton has said there. But what I'm also saying is we don't entirely know what's going to happen as these products evolve. And if you have a wave of advertising and marketing for products like we haven't seen in several decades, I don't know that that will be the case, but I can't tell you that that wouldn't be a problem either.
Okay. Dr. Britton, do you have anything to add to this particular discussion?
Well, in answer to the question of how we keep tabs on what is going on, I think it's the more crucial than ever to be monitoring smoking and nicotine use behaviours in young people and in adults. That's where the proof of the pudding lies. So we have the good fortune to have decent surveys of young people across the UK, and they all show the same thing as Dr. Hammond has said, which is negligible use by non-smokers. And I entirely echo the comments that children who are more likely to try vaping products are much more likely also to be trying cigarettes anyway. They come from families where people smoke, or maybe where those smokers have become vapers. They're exposed to the products, they're more likely to use them. But we just have to watch what is happening. I share concern about the ability of some of the commercial organisations involved in this market, even if not now, certainly in the future, to target children and target non-smokers with a lifestyle product. And that would be negative for public health. So there is a very strong case to restrict and control and monitor advertising, but the proof of the pudding is in who's using the product and how long for. And at the moment, the signs in the UK for sure are that both among children and among adults, use by never smokers is negligible.
Thank you. Senator Hartling, to be followed by Senator Eggleton.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's 8 minutes.
I'm questioning, I guess, about we know a lot of us are really familiar with secondhand smoke and how that affects us and is harmful. So I'm wondering about the vaping or the e-cigarettes. Is there any research done on the effects of that? Can it affect us, and how could it affect us? Anything on that? Did you want to start, Dr. Hammond?
Sure. You know, I think you can sort of make some inferences from what we believe to be the case with the direct health effects, which is there's just a lower level of chemicals, there's fewer chemicals in the air, and so it may present a public health risk, but it won't be the same as smoking. And I think my understanding of the regulations in Canada, which as I understand are mainly provincial, is that it prohibits vaping in public spaces where smoking is prohibited, and I would suggest that that is a reasonable preventive measure, which isn't to equate the two risks.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Dr. Britton, do you wish to comment on this?
Yeah, I would. I agree that on the levels of risk, and we've discussed this already. On use in public places, I think it's a serious error to categorise electronic cigarettes with tobacco cigarettes in that context. The evidence for harm from vapor to others is tenuous at best. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In my view, not using an electronic cigarette in an enclosed, particularly one that produces clouds of vapor, is a courtesy issue. It's just not a pleasant thing to do. But equally, I recall sitting on a train to Stockholm station once and realising well into the journey that the man sitting opposite me had been using an electronic cigarette all the way through that journey. He wasn't exhaling clouds of vapor, and I could no more object to that than if he'd taken out a salbutamol inhaler to relieve his asthma. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, but there's a further issue of, for example, in Britain anyway, we have a very high prevalence of smoking in mental health populations. We have a big problem with smoking in hospitals providing secondary care. Now, electronic cigarettes can be part of the solution to that. When you come in and use our services, we ask you not to smoke. We will offer you the best help we can to help you quit smoking. But if you don't want that or can't do that, please, while you're here, don't smoke tobacco. But if you want to use an electronic cigarette, go ahead.
Okay.
So I think it's fair. If we categorise e-cigarettes with tobacco cigarettes in where they can be used, the message again comes to the public that these are the same in terms of risk, and they're not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Britton. In the last, we've got an echo here. Okay, Dr. Britton. In the last exchange, Dr. Hammond suggested that perhaps the UK has very recently tightened its restrictions around vaping products. If I understood him correctly, could you comment on that? On advertising. In terms of advertising, yes.
We have a voluntary code of practice through the Advertising Standards Authority. There's one for print media and there's one for broadcast media. And they are not allowed to promote electronic cigarettes to young people at all. Some limited advertising is accepted, but it's not allowed to associate the vaping product, say, with a tobacco product. So there is a voluntary code that is followed, but we see very little advertising. I see very little advertising, but that may reflect my low consumption of some of these media rather.
Right. We have voluntary agreements in our advertising industry, but it's restricted to those who are members of the association. Dr. Hammond?
My understanding is that in 2016, through a European directive, it banned tobacco advertising and radio, so that's not voluntary. It gives countries the option to do things like billboard advertising. Scotland has decided not to do that. My understanding is that England right now is still permitting them. So my understanding is that because of a European directive, that TV and radio advertisements are no longer allowed.
Dr. Britton?
That's in the process of coming into force. The new Tobacco Control Directive becomes law on the 20th of May.
Okay, so what Dr. Hammond summarized is in the process of becoming effective.
Yes, our advertising, so went from free advertising through the Advertising Standards Authority controls, which, yes, they are voluntary controls, but they are reasonably well adhered to, and certainly through a complaint process, adverts that are deemed to have broken the code are then removed. But yes, things are getting much tighter in May.
Thank you. Senator Eggleton, and depending on the length, possibly one more question, but
Okay, I want to drill down a little bit more on this marketing advertising situation, because we've got to figure out where to draw the line here. We obviously don't want to promote to youth, but on the other hand, we want to make people who are willing to use this product or could use this product aware of its existence. So it's easy to say, well, you can't advertise directly to youth. Well, but there is a crossover here where in trying to promote it as a less hazardous form of smoking and a way of moving towards cessation, there's got to be some means of doing that, and there could be a crossover that can create a problem. So where do you draw the line here? What forms of marketing or advertising or promotion as a cessation product would we allow to be carried out for vaporized e-cigarettes that don't cross over that line?
Dr. Hammond?
Well, I was hoping nobody would ask me to be specific. Look, half of all of our smokers in Canada have used a vaporized product already. It's about 80% when you look at younger smokers. So I don't think it's a case of sort of making people aware of e-cigarettes. I think I also stated earlier that I think it is important to provide market advantages to the less harmful products. So vaporized products should be allowed to be promoted more than smoked products. Your question was, okay, what exactly does that look like? I think you can have, I keep saying tax price because that is a very important determinant. So I think you can have differential taxation price levels. I think you can have different types of health warnings. So if cigarettes are ultimately sold in plain, standardized cigarette packaging, you could allow brand imagery on vaporized products. You could allow product displays in retail outlets, which are currently prohibited for smoked products. You could allow more price promotions. And perhaps you could allow some non-lifestyle advertising in adult-oriented settings. So bars, direct mail. So I don't pretend to have the exact answer on where you should draw the line, and there is no objective answer to your question, I don't think. It's possible that Dr. Britton or others would draw that line somewhat more liberally, but I suppose I'm guided by being a bit more cautious about allowing advertising. It's much, much easier to permit more advertising in the future than it is to scale it back. It's a lot harder to put the genie back in the bottle, so perhaps I'm being a bit more conservative, but I think you can still incentivize vaporized use over smoked without necessarily going to the full lengths that are in the bill at the moment.
Dr. Britton, do you have a quick comment?
Broadly, I would agree with that position. The only thing is that many smokers have yet to try electronic cigarettes, and even, in the UK still, we have a substantial proportion of smokers who believe that nicotine is hazardous and that they shouldn't use these products for that reason. So I think there's a very strong case for health promotion messages to established smokers. But this also comes back to the denormalisation or renormalisation arguments. What's happening in Canada and in Britain is that smoking rates are falling very quickly. And in Britain, since electronic cigarettes became widely used, we've seen prevalence fall by 0.9 of a percentage point each year for the last 3 years. In the absence of any new significant policy, our standardised packaging comes in next month. So that is a huge fall for free, really, just from a consumer solution to the problem. We are seeing smoking becoming denormalised. And if the other side of that coin is that electronic cigarette use becomes normalised, I wouldn't have a problem with that. The benefits to society long term, if all of our smokers switch directly to electronic cigarettes as a result of advertising, and even let's say it, some people become nicotine users as a consequence of that process, will still be less than the status quo, which is to have a fifth or a sixth of our adults killing themselves with tobacco.